Hey everyone, welcome back to Bear It In Mind. This video is an exam paper walkthrough of the 2022 Paper 1 exam paper, specifically section D, the psychopathology topic. In a previous video I gave an overview of the whole paper with some tips and advice, so do check that out if you haven't already done so, and as always you'll find links below to the exam paper and the mark scheme, as well as links to videos on any of the parts of psychopathology that we cover in this video. Remember to pause the video and have a go at the questions yourself first, looking for the command words, topic and marks available before I walk you through it. In the psychopathology section for this paper, there are 5 short questions, 3 of which are research methods questions and an 8-mark essay. Question 13 says, describe the statistical infrequency and failure to function adequately definitions of abnormality, 6 marks. The command word is describe, and the question uses the word and, so you have to do both statistical infrequency and failure to function adequately. This is a 6-mark question, so you really need to think about how to unpack and elaborate on the definition. Obviously, if you are writing one sentence, that's not going to get you all the marks. For 6 marks, you're thinking about it in terms of 3 marks each. For statistical infrequency, you could write about 1, how it's rare and uncommon. 2, extreme scores on a normal distribution curve are more than 2 standard deviations away from the mean. And 3, an example. And if you're going to use an example, make sure it explicitly and clearly illustrates the definition. So for example, you could use IQ and how scores below 70 or above 130 will be considered abnormal because they are more than 2 standard deviations away from the mean. For failure to function adequately, you could write about 1, it's the inability to cope with everyday living. 2, Rosenhan and Seligman's criteria, for example, personal distress and irrationality. And 3, give an example. And again, make sure it explicitly and clearly illustrates the definition. So if you were going to talk about depression, you might say how that person may be unable to keep a job or they don't take care of their own personal hygiene. Question 14 says, outline one limitation of systematic desensitization as a treatment of phobias. 3 marks. This is a nice 3-mark question, but make sure you read the question carefully. It's about a limitation of systematic desensitization, so don't waste your time describing how it works. For 3 marks, make sure to be very clear in unpacking the limitation. Don't be vague, make sure you use key terminology and possibly expand your limitations with a comparison with another treatment, like flooding. One possible limitation you could write about is how systematic desensitization is time consuming when compared to alternatives such as flooding, as the person with the phobia needs to be trained in relaxation techniques and gradual exposure, which can take many sessions. And for some people this might be too much and require too much commitment and motivation, and therefore are unable to complete the treatment program. Question 15 says, a biological psychologist wanted to see if there was a positive correlation between heart rate, measured in beats per minute, and levels of a stress hormone, measured in micrograms, in people with obsessive compulsive disorder. She wrote a directional hypothesis and collected data from 20 people with OCD. The psychologist chose to use the Pearson's test to analyse the data because she was testing for a correlation. Explain one other reason why the psychologist used a Pearson's test in this study. 4 marks. So here we have the first research methods question of paper 1, and as usual it comes with a bit of a scenario. It's really important that you take the time to annotate this scenario because there are clues in the text that will help you answer the later questions. Have a try at annotating it now if you haven't already done so to see what you spot, because I'm going to come back to this as we look at each question. Question 15 is about statistical tests. For statistical tests, you need to know the 3 reasons that affect the choice of each statistical test, and they are: 1, is it a difference or relationship? 2, is it unrelated or related data? And number 3, the level of measurement. Now, as with all research methods questions, the question requires you to apply your knowledge to the study described. Notice the phrase "in this study" at the end of the question. So the Pearson's test is used when the research is correlational, so looking for a relationship, but the question stated that we needed to choose another reason. Whether the data is unrelated or related doesn't affect the choice of stats tests for correlations, so we don't write about this one. So you need to write about the level of measurement. The level of measurement is the data gathered off the participants. Because this is a correlation, there are two measurements: heart rate measured in beats per minute and levels of stress hormone measured in micrograms. Both of these measurements are examples of interval data because they are of a fixed equal interval. Nominal data is data that's in categories and frequency. Ordinal data is data that can be ranked or put in order and is not of a fixed equal interval. Measuring beats per minute in terms of time and measuring the amount of something in terms of grams are examples of measurements that have a fixed equal interval. Question 16 says, which of the following scattergrams best represents a correlation coefficient of plus 0.42? 1 mark. This is the second research methods question, which tests your understanding and familiarity with what various correlation coefficients look like on graphs. It's a multiple choice question, so please make sure to fill it in correctly as per the instructions. If you're not sure what a correlation coefficient is, it's a measurement of the strength of a correlation. Correlations are measured from -1 to +1, ranging from negative to positive correlations, with 0 being no correlation. The correlation coefficient of plus 0.42 is the calculated value produced by the Pearson's test. As with all multiple choice questions, you want to rule out the ones you know are definitely not right. Because the correlation coefficient is a positive correlation, we can rule out A and D because they are negative correlations. If it helps, here is an image of what the different strengths of correlations would look like when plotted on graphs. From these images, I hope you can now see that B looks more like a 0.8 correlation, with C looking most like a 0.42 correlation. Question 17 says, the researcher used the following table of critical values. Is the psychologist's calculated value significant? With reference to table 1, explain your answer, 4 marks. Carefully note that there are two parts to the question. The first part asks you whether the calculated value is significant. The second part asks you to explain your answer. To work out if the calculated value is significant or not, you need to compare it with a critical value. In the exam, you are often provided with a critical values table, and you need to identify which is the correct critical value to compare with the calculated value. There are 3 pieces of information you need to identify the critical value. Number 1, 1 or 2-tailed tests. This is related to whether the hypothesis is directional or non-directional. You may have noticed that when we read the study scenario just before question 15, that it said she wrote a directional hypothesis. That's the clue that it's a 1-tailed test. So this means we are not interested in this row because that's for 2-tailed tests. We can ignore it. We are interested in this row. The second piece of information you need is the significance level, and the standard significance level in psychology is 0.05 unless the question states otherwise. This now means that we are interested in this column. The final piece of information is N, which is the number of participants, or for some statistical tests, including this one, it's DF, which stands for degrees of freedom. Now don't worry too much about what that means. If we look back again at the study scenario, it stated that there were 20 people. So now we're looking at this row. However, if you take a careful look at what's written underneath the critical value table, you'll see it says a few things, but notice what it says about degrees of freedom. Degrees of freedom equals N minus 2. So we know N, the number of participants, is 20, but we need to minus 2, so DF is 18. So putting all that together, the critical value is 0.378. So to finally answer the question, are the results significant? Well, if you look carefully again at what's written under the critical value table, it states, calculated value of R, which is the Pearson's test, must be equal to or more than the critical value for significance to be shown. So here's how I would write the answer for 4 marks. Yes, the results are significant at the 0.05 level. It's a 1-tailed test because it's a directional hypothesis, and DF equals 18 because n equals 20 minus 2. So the calculated value of 0.42 is greater than the critical value of 0.378. This brings us to the last question. Question 18 says, discuss the genetic explanation for OCD. 8 marks. The command word for this question is discuss, which typically means that we need to provide some knowledge of a theory or study, the AO1, and then evaluate it in terms of its strengths and limitations to form a discussion, the AO3. A typical 16-mark discuss essay question is broken down into 6 marks for AO1 and 10 marks for AO3. So for an 8-mark discuss question, this is halved, so 3 marks for AO1 and 5 marks for AO3. It's helpful to think about it in terms of 1 good paragraph of AO1 followed by 2 good paragraphs of AO3, and even better if those AO3 paragraphs can be for and against, evidence and then a counter argument. So for the AO1, always start with the big picture before going into the details. So you could write that the genetic explanation for OCD focuses on how the condition may be inherited, whereby a genetic predisposition or vulnerability has been passed on from one generation to the next. You could then specifically write about particular genes that may be involved. There are a number you could write about here, but as an example, you could write about the mutation of the COMT gene, which is thought to affect dopamine levels, and the mutation of the SERT gene, which is thought to affect serotonin levels. In terms of AO3, you then might provide some supporting evidence for the role of genetics. For example, Nesta et al.'s 2010 twin study research, where they found higher concordance rates of 68% in MZ twins compared to 31% in DZ twins. You could then provide a counter-argument to the biological explanation through criticising this study. This is because the concordance rates for MZ twins are only 68%, but if OCD is purely genetic, then we would expect it to be 100%, which suggests that environmental factors could be involved. What environmental factors? Well, you could get really fancy and talk about the diathesis stress model, which offers an explanation of how biology and the environment could both be involved through someone having the genetic predisposition, the genetic vulnerability through the mutated gene, but this may never materialize and express itself unless it's triggered by an environmental stressor. In fact, Cromer et al. In 2007 found that over 50% of their OCD patients had experienced a trauma in their past, strongly suggesting that genetic explanations alone are not enough to explain OCD. That would be more than enough for 8 marks, but alternative evaluation might include the use of debates, such as determinism, whereby the genetic explanation suggests that the cause of OCD is purely biological. So that completes not only section D, but also paper 1. But just before we finish, I said at the end of paper 1, I'd provide a quick summary of the main takeaway lessons from the whole paper. So to summarise, number 1, fill in multiple choice questions according to the instructions. Number 2, remember that there are some research methods questions on paper 1 and always apply your answer to the scenario provided. Number 3, 60-mark essays are broken into 6 marks for AO1 and 10 marks for AO3. Number 4, 8-mark questions are half this, 3 marks for AO1, 5 marks for AO3. Number 5, and 16-mark application questions are broken down into 6 marks for AO1, 4 marks for AO2 application, and 6 marks for AO3 evaluation. And number 6, always read the question carefully so that you answer the question set rather than the question you want to answer. We saw this in the attachment essay on animal studies, in the situational variables essay on where we obey, and we also saw this in the memory questions on one way researchers have investigated short-term memory, where you don't write about results. As ever, links to videos that explain any of the parts of psychopathology that we covered in this video can be found below. I hope you found all these videos helpful, and I wish you all the best in your upcoming exams.